Okay. I'm live on my side of Instagram. How are you doing, Dr. Salem?
I am going live here as well. I'm doing great. I'm doing great. It's great to be here today. Again, another Sperm Meets Egg, another show, another great topic.
Exactly. Talking about topics, we're talking about donor eggs tonight. It's I don't know if something you've ever had to think about, but I know for me, there was a point where my wife and I actually thought about using donor eggs at one point, and so I've been through some of the some of the concerns about it. So I'm definitely going to share some of those tonight. I didn't know if you wanted to start off tonight or you want me to.
You know what? Why don't you start this one off? I think this is definitely something near and dear to your heart, and would love to hear. Yeah, would love to hear that story, Dr. Amos, and I'll kind of come in later. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to share about, and I want to make sure people know, for some reason, it looks like the Facebook pages are not working. And so if you, unfortunately, I'm going to see if I can figure out why, but it may not be working. So if like I said, if you're on Instagram, you'll see this, but I don't know if Ari, you want to let people know on the Facebook page that there's something going wrong with it. It's not streaming to it. So, but yeah, so we knew it was gonna be hard for us to get pregnant again because when we first started, and got pregnant, it was very difficult. I mean, we didn't even know it was going to work. We got one shot, and it was successful, but we had to wait 6 years before we could try again, and we were pretty sure it wasn't going to work. And we talked about the idea of possibly using donor eggs. And where I grew up, my dad, would always say things like, well, if it's not blood, it's not family. And so one of the things that, when he said that, it made me think like, wow, is my dad not going to, he actually said to me one time, he said, I don't know if I could love someone if they're not blood or something the same way. And I was shocked by that. And it really shocked me to think that anyone would be, in my mind, so callous or something, just like, how could they not love a kid? And so we thought about it, and we were like, hey, we have to do it. And we were actually fortunate enough that we didn't have to. But the thing was, like, it was one of those things where I kept feeling like, well, it's, will be my wife's eggs, will it be like her? And after I had my daughters, there was this kind of epiphany I had. And that epiphany was, my kids weren't me because of my DNA. I even joke around, people go, I wish they actually did have some of my DNA attributes. But really what it was is they were more me because of the way we do things, my mannerisms, stuff like that. And I've shared that with patients. Whenever they want to use donor eggs, I tell them, like, listen, like, I know we think about DNA so much, but what's so interesting about it is that the DNA your kid gets is your parents' DNA, right? It's not even your DNA, to be honest. It's just you are made up by two parts of DNA, and whatever happens to be more dominant might be represented in you, but what you get to your kid may be different. That's why your kid can look like the milkman's son and not your own. And so the thing that really changed for me was we never questioned if we ever wanted to use donor. Like, we're like, hey, we have to, we'll do it. We didn't have to. And, we did we did that kind of closure cycle. We were able to have success. But in the end, that my view changed so much. I started to realize how using donor eggs or using donor sperm wouldn't be that big of a deal, because I didn't have that fear anymore. I realized, wow, my kids, sure, they may not look exactly like you, but I always tell people, if they look like you, it just means you have some weird feature that they're pointing out that you have the same feature. When people say my kids look like me, they're just saying, no, their eyes are real close, their noses might be a little bit bigger or something like that. But in reality, the point is that it's not about the DNA. It's about how you raise them and stuff like that. And I know you have a young one at home, and I know you haven't seen it yet, but you're going to start seeing like all the little innuendo, all the little weird things you do that they'll do, and the sayings you say, they'll say. And that's not from DNA. And that's the thing, if I ever can pass along to a patient is that if there's anything to feel good about, if they're worried about using donors and things like that, is that, you don't have to be worried. They'll be your kid. It'll be exactly your kid, and no one will ever tell you different. And DNA doesn't matter at that point, because at that point, it's how you raise them. So it's kind of that whole nurture versus nature, thought.
Absolutely. I mean, I just, just like along your story, I'll wear the other hat. I'll wear the hat coming from the side of the fertility doctor. But, a question that I have often been fortunate enough to be able to ask a lot of, parents that were my patients is, how do you feel? You now delivered this beautiful child that, you went through, 9 months of pregnancy. You've had this incredible experience. These are, folks who used a donor egg. And I've never heard one person ever tell me, I feel like less of a parent. I feel like less of a mom. I feel like less of a dad. It's just never even come up. I've had what feels like countless conversations with folks about this. And I think that, that's one of those things that has really stayed with me, and it's grown over time. And I try to take that back to a lot of, my patients that are having this difficult decision. For a lot of people, it's a difficult decision. I think there are some people that have a little bit more ease with it, but it's a difficult decision for many reasons. Number one, it's never anybody's initial plan. I think that's just a fair statement. I think number two, there are, major cultural, sometimes religious implications here, family implications. What will other people think? What will my friends think? That go along with this. And so it is a tall hill to climb to come to that point and say, hey, I'm ready to make that jump from, trying to use my own eggs to using donor eggs. But nobody, when they are on the other side of that finish line, looks back and says, I wish I didn't do it. I've never heard it. And again, it might exist out there, but I'm just saying I've never heard it. And so I think, that's just taking the very wide lens view of the donor egg process. And I think from a fertility doctor, I think it's always one of these things that is a careful transition. Like I know you and I, when we're having this discussion with our patients, it's probably one of our most serious discussions that we have, because we never take it lightly. We're not, it's very rare that we say, hey, you have virtually no chance that this is going to work. But it's a calculation of sorts at a certain point. I mean, if we, have a bucket of resources, a bucket of fertility benefits, or a bucket of resources, money, time, emotional effort, physical effort that we can put towards treatment, fertility treatment. Sometimes it's better to manage that bucket in such a way that you go to the donor egg process a little sooner. But again, these are very personal conversations. They're very important conversations that an REI, should help guide you. It's kind of like they're holding the map, but you're holding the steering wheel. And I think they should help guide you, but it's definitely a very personal decision on the part of patients. But that's just kind of like a very broad, kind of experience that I've had over time. But I'm curious, Dr. Amos, when do you choose to have that conversation with folks about moving to a donor?
I mean, I think I let the patient kind of, let me know when too. I mean, it's like you said that there's a lot of parts to this, right? So that question of, that bucket of funds, right? If I know someone's dwindling down, and I'm like, listen, they get one more chance with their own, or they can do donor eggs. I know the chances are low on their side. Using their own eggs, I may say, listen, we can try again, but you might want to use donor. I can tell you as a prior patient, no one ever goes, I can't wait to use donor eggs or donor sperm. No one's ever jumping towards that, right? And so it's that point where I think it's our job, as you mentioned, to steer them a little bit with the map and say, like, listen, you can keep trying, but the chance are low. And like you said, it's never zero. I mean, rarely is it ever zero, unless someone's 45 with a FSH of like 80. Rarely is it going to be zero. And so it's a hard discussion, because it's usually what I usually do is I tend to bring it up like it's just a topic. Like, hey, we're not talking about it now, not needing. We're never going to try that way. We're just trying just your eggs. But just so you know, there is this option. And then eventually, if things aren't going well, I prepare people for it. I said, it might be difficult. I might bring it up again and say, again, don't want you to feel pressure or anything, but there are times I do jump in, and I'm sure you do too, as like when you have that patient where you just, it's not going to work. I mean, and I still wait till they're ready. And the one thing I think that's important, I'm sure you probably tell your patient this, is it's never really too late to do donor eggs, right?
Mm.
So in the end, they need to be ready. And the reason patients need to be ready is because why force them now, right? There's no reason to force them. And I'd say try with your own eggs, try whatever you want to do, take the time, because your chances of getting pregnant with donor eggs is not going to be any different now than it's going to be 3 years from now. And so I tend to, look at the patient and see what they think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, these conversations, there are definitely some wrong times to have that conversation. I feel like I've heard some of my own friends who have gone through the process of IVF who, they go into the clinic and the numbers don't look perfect, but the clinic has decided that there are some cutoff points, and they tell them, oh, well, too bad, so sad. You gotta use a donor egg to come here. And it's like, wow, we just met you. We just met this clinic. We just started the process, and already you're telling me, there's no hope. There's no work. It's not worth trying, et cetera. And so I think, that's kind of one of those examples in my worldview that is probably one of the few wrong times to definitely have that conversation. But I think that, one of the things that makes this conversation a bit of a difficult one is that not only do folks not start the process with that in mind, people can be pretty unaware of the difference between the success rates of using a donor egg and the success rate of using their own eggs. And so generally what we mean by that is this idea of the genetic integrity of the egg. So the genetic integrity of the egg to form a genetically normal embryo at the age of 45 is less than 10%. But when you have somebody who's 30, that may be the egg donor, or 27, well, that could be about 70% or even a little bit higher sometimes. So, that trade-off is massive. And then, of course, you have the trade-off of when you're 45, it's very difficult to get, enough eggs to get 10 embryos to genetically test, in theory, to get, one that's normal. Whereas when you're 27, you probably only need about, 8 eggs? Would you say 8 eggs is probably ballpark fair? I don't know. To get a genetically normal embryo. And so I think this is one of those things that's it's hard to grasp the extent of the difference. And that's one of the reasons why egg donor is so much more efficient. But I mean, how do you explain, why egg donor works so much better?
I think one of the biggest things is, right, they're not infertile, right? I mean, at least not suspected, right? I mean, 1 in 8 of them might be fertile or something like that. Well, not even 1 in 8, be like 1 in closer to like 15, just because technically there's a male and female when you talk about fertility. So when you talk about 1 in 8 couples, you're talking about half of that. But they're not infertile. I mean, most people do get pregnant right away. I mean, that's the one thing is like, I didn't know that either when my wife and I were trying, but most people really do get pregnant right away. And so a lot of these donors are they're going to be slightly better chances. The other thing that donors do too is a lot of times couples who use donors are older, and the males are older too. And there's plenty of data out there that shows that when the male is older, that the benefit from the younger female is more than just expected based off their age, that it actually helps improve the sperm because of the mechanisms in the follicle. So I think that could have some of it to do as well. You touched on something I wanted to talk about for a second, which was we were talking about, when do we tell patients, stuff like that. And you've talked about other doctors telling them that they have to use donor eggs. And I hear that a lot. Like, oh yeah, the place we went to said we can't use my own eggs. I have to use donor eggs. That's the one thing I know I never do. I mean, the one thing I always tell patients is, I don't care if your chances are close to zero. If you need to try to see that will help them sometimes go on the donor eggs. And that's why I always let patients try. And I tell them, I'm very honest with them. I say, listen, I don't know if this is going to work, but if you need this closure, you should try this. And that's actually why, like at our clinic, we do that. We do a closure package where someone could try. If it doesn't work, then they go on the donor eggs. But I think that's really helpful for some people, because there is that feeling in the back of your head, like, but what if? That was actually how my wife and I got pregnant the last time. Was we said, let's just try one more try. And so having that, even if it's failing, I've had several patients where we go through, we do the cycle, and it goes back, and they see only like one egg is made and nothing comes from it. And they turn them in, they're like, yeah, we're ready. And that's the most important part, because they have to be ready, you know.
Absolutely. I think it's so important. I mean, I think it's so important from the standpoint of also, the donor cycle is very, very likely to work in most cases. And so I think it's really important for individuals, couples who go through this process to feel like they left nothing on the table if that's important to them. Because they're probably going to get pregnant pretty quickly with the donor process. Now, not always, of course, but the odds are high. And so you don't want to kind of look back and say, oh, I wish I would have tried another cycle or done something like that. But
So
yeah.
one of the things I think for patients who are listening to this, or potential people want to use donors, I think is understanding it a little bit. So just to kind of understand, there are really kind of two types of donors out there. They're what are called fresh donors, and then frozen donors. And the difference is one is fresh eggs that you get from your donor, another is frozen. I tend to, one of the things I always, when I talk to patients, I never want to just help them get pregnant at that time, but I want to build their family. And so I'm sure you do this as well. I ask them, how many kids are you wanting? And that plays a little bit of a part in it, because if someone says to me, I just want one pregnancy, I think donor eggs are a great way to do it, especially frozen, because you get 6-8 eggs, and that should be enough to be able to get one line birth from. But if someone says to me, well, I want 2 or 3 kids, yeah, they can buy those frozen eggs, but cost effective wise, it might actually make more sense to have a fresh donor go through. And so by a fresh donor going through, they could get all the eggs now. And so now they can get maybe 16 to 20 eggs. And that might allow them to build a family versus just getting pregnant once. I wasn't sure, how do you talk to patients about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the egg, I would say that historically there's some important aspects here in terms of the frozen versus the fresh egg, bit of things. I think there was a point where the frozen eggs were really, it was a long shot because the freezing process wasn't as good. Now the freezing process has gotten so much better that even a relatively smaller batch of eggs will very likely lead to, one embryo that's used that leads to a baby, sometimes more than that. But I agree with you very much in the sense of like the family planning stage of this is incredibly important. It also plays a big role as you think about, if it's their first child and they want 2, maybe 3 children, do they want them to be genetic siblings? Because then you want the same batch of eggs, the same, batch of sperm, whatever. And that's really important. And it's sometimes something that, it can be overlooked a little bit when you're just in the moment and you're just kind of doing what's right in front of your face. And so I think that it's really important to talk about the big picture goals for that couple. It can also, quite honestly, in certain cases, be more cost effective to do one thing versus the other. So you have to talk about what's the big picture here? Where are we trying to go? Because one thing might be much more cost effective than another. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about, all the donor egg banks out there. And, what's your opinion of how to navigate that world? There's all these different egg banks.
Well, I know if you ever heard me, I think I've told you before, I hate the donor world. I think they take advantage of people. I think that they are, I mean, a matter of fact, I have a patient today who went through a place, had a guaranteed program, and the person went through and they got day 7 blastocyst, and they call it, well, that meets the guarantee. And I said to them, I go, guys, this is day 7 embryos. Like, we know the chance are lower. How can you call that towards the guarantee? And they're like, well, we feel they do well. And I said, well, do you also guarantee like, embryos are poor quality? And they're like, well, no. I said, why not? Because their rates are lower. So why would you guarantee, call that meeting the guarantee? And so, after it didn't work, I call them and send them messages, and it's been actually very frustrating, and so these companies, they're so just about the money that it hurts, because this is a real option for patients. And so it's one of the reasons I started our own, was for that exact reason. I'm like, I need to find places that are good places. It's never perfect. People do go through donor eggs and don't get pregnant. It happens, and it sucks when it happens. But these banks, like I said, like, I think we do it really well the way we do it at our bank. Our bank is everything's included. Whatever you pay, you get everything, all the way through the transfer and everything. But the way a lot of these other banks do it is they adjust the cost. So if you're a certain culture that's, let's say a minority, you might have to pay more. They, do things to try to sell, small batches. If there's only 2 eggs or 1 egg, they'll say, okay, well, we'll do it cheaper if you get a bunch of different donors together, and then that makes it harder for you, because then you're like, well, do I put back 2 embryos, but they might be different, as you said, maternal DNA. So I think they're great. I think frozen egg banks are great from the standpoint of this idea that you have a huge batch of eggs, right? You don't have to wait for some to go through. You don't have to wait 6 months till she's ready. You can just go in there and look at 1,000 different donors and pick a donor. And that gives more options to women, because now they can sit there and say, that person represents me best. Versus when you talk about, people going through naturally, it's harder. They're not as many, because it's so inconvenient, right? I mean, a woman's sitting around going, oh, waiting for the call. When do I have to go donate eggs? And it's just not possible. So frozen eggs has really helped it a lot. I think it gives so much just empowerment to women to be able to decide, who they want versus what's available. Because, as I know, lots of clinics used to do their own fresh. And again, they're like, this is the 10 donors we have. And you just had to pick the best you can. And so frozen allows, even us, we keep having people go through and do the frozen cycle. So it just gives us more ability to offer more things. So that's what I would have to say about frozen.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I mean, I think there's been kind of this evolution over time. And, interestingly, one of the statistics that really jumps out at me from the recent, census data and maternal data that is available publicly is that the fastest group of first-time moms is the group that is 40 to 45. And so the group that is 40 to 45 is having their first child at the fastest rate ever. And it's telling me a few different things. Obviously, for some people, that's a natural pregnancy. But it also is telling me that there are a lot of pregnancies taking place that are likely from IVF or very likely from donor in that age group. And so what we're seeing is this kind of, in relative terms, in a real explosion of use of this technology. And there's, increasing demand on donor eggs. And so one of the things that I've been, quite honestly surprised by is in part is how quickly some of the donor's eggs get taken off of the donor egg bank. I mean, they go really, really quickly when there's somebody that maybe is favorable to a lot of people or relatable to a lot of people for whatever reason it might be. How do we solve that? I mean, let's just think big picture. I mean, how do we solve this? I mean, there's a supply demand imbalance here. How do we create more eggs for people to use? How do we help people get there?
It's a great thing you brought up, because I actually have an opinion about this. Not surprising, probably, but one of the limitations right now, all these rules we make are not keeping up with how fast things are changing. And so one of the rules we made is that, people can only go through 6 times, right? And so ASRM made this guideline that, someone can only donate 6 times. And the reason for that was consanguinity, that you didn't want people to have, let's say, use the same donor and then those kids meet up someday and then, they have a kid. And that was kind of like the main reason behind that. And then you get the donor eggs. You're like, well, now that person takes those same eggs and gives them to 3 couples. And so 3 times 6, then that's 18 couples, right? And so now people have questioned whether, we should allow that. I think there was that case recently with the sperm where the guy had something like 54, different children or something like that. But the way I think you could do it is why couldn't we allow people to go through more? Because not everyone's donating eggs, but there are some pretty cool things people do. But if you just guarantee that those eggs will only go to a certain location. So you say, okay, listen, one batch can go this date, two batches can go this date, and then you prevent that anyways. You don't have that risk because you're putting it across, the states in a way where you don't have that risk. So I've always wondered that's one way we can increase it by, not having that kind of limit. The other thing is, and I've seen some places do this, it's not easy, but there are a lot of people who can't afford IVF, but who have very good eggs that could probably donate. So like for someone, let's say, for example, someone has sperm issues. Well, could you potentially say, well, maybe we'll let, why don't you go through and this other couple will pay for you to go through IVF and you give them half their eggs. And there's actually a company doing this right now. I don't know why I can't think of the name of it right now. It's just with a C. I know that. But what they do is they do it for people who want to donate their eggs. So they go to young women who want to donate their eggs and say, hey, donate your eggs and you get half of them we take, and then you get to get the other half, and they pay for everything. And then they take a little portion of that, of course. But I think that's one way people are looking at it. But I think the limitation affects it. And I think, how do we get more people to do it? Because most people, aren't just jumping to do egg retrievals, unless there's a way we could do it very easy, where we didn't have to put them through so much stimulation.
Yeah. Boy, that would certainly make things a lot easier. I mean, it's a pretty big time commitment, and it's there's some risk. It's very safe, but there's some risk with any very safe medical procedure even. So, I think this idea is wonderful, and it's always been something that's really appealed to me. This idea of kind of sharing the wealth in a way, and for some people, of course, that's going to be very appealing, and for other people, it's not. But I think one of the big differences that I always think about with regards to eggs versus other things in medicine that we donate is that there isn't really a limited supply in the same way. Those eggs are going to be gone anyway that month. So, of course, we have 2 kidneys. We could donate one to somebody we love very much, and we're willing to make that sacrifice. With eggs, the difference here is that those eggs would have been gone anyway that month. So you are certainly going through an inconvenient thing to go through IVF and some risk, but you're not kind of reducing the number of eggs that you would have had to become to do an egg donor. It doesn't make you less fertile later on or something of that kind. So here you can do this amazing thing for somebody else and potentially for yourself, just like you're saying, Dr. Amos, which is, having eggs frozen for your own future, should you ever need to use them down the road. And it honestly, it reminds me of one patient that I had who was an egg donor back in the day. And she ended up, 10 years after the fact, experiencing infertility of her own. And it really struck me because she said, I really wish I just had some of those eggs that I could still have access to, and it was one of these things where it kind of just leaves a real impression on you. And you say, wow, it feels like that would be fair if she had some of her own eggs saved up from that point as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things when we, I told you, like I said, I hate this industry, by the way. So I feel they just take advantage of people. But one of the interesting things, I don't know if you ever see this, is when you buy eggs, it drives me insane that sometimes you'll get these eggs and they either have like a vacuole in it or it won't survive the thaw. And then when we go back to these companies, they say to us, well, we don't expect them all to survive the thaw. I'm thinking, you're charging someone, how much? And just in case people don't realize how expensive it is, for the average place for about 6 eggs, it could be around $18,000 just for 6 eggs. Now, there are some that have specials. I know I'm not going to name any companies here, name drop them, but there are some that will even do like 10,000 and 12,000, but you get like a random bunch of eggs. So you don't get them all from one donor or something like that. But there are donors. There's one couple I met. They wanted a donor. They're both doctors, and they wanted to use someone who was intelligent. So they wanted to get someone from Stanford. And so this person was from Stanford, and they wanted something like $25,000 to $30,000 for their eggs or something like that. It was this insane amount. And what was funny was I was looking at other donors for them, and I found out this other donor had better ACT scores than the one that went from Stanford. I'm like, this person's actually on a standardized test smarter. And so it's a really interesting industry because and I think, we shouldn't even just talk about donor eggs. I know we're on this, but I mean, even donor sperm's kind of the same way. Like, the cost going up, the same principles happen for men as they do women. But it's, that industry also got taken advantage of. So like back in the day, sperm wasn't that expensive. You could get sperm, and I mean, sometimes you even get free from medical students and stuff. And once the LGBTQ community, kind of blew up and started using sperm, all of a sudden prices just went through the roof, and now it's ridiculous and single women and stuff. So the whole industry, in my mind, is a little, I don't want to use the word corrupt, but I think you're right. Like, is there a way somehow you can almost socialize it to, like, kind of like bartering, like, hey, you need eggs? I got eggs. I don't have enough. Oh, I have enough, and it almost could bring everything down. And it's something I've always dreamed of, but I don't know if I can ever make it happen. But one of the things I saw was, Crazy Beautiful here was on one of the send messages. We're talking about asking, what does it mean? Like, kind of, what does it mean when you get a donor egg? Like, are you just taking the egg and then like their DNA is going in the egg? And so, how does that work? And I think it's really important for people to understand that, this is another person's egg. It technically does not have any of your DNA in it. Now, that being said, there is a thing called epigenetics. So epigenetics is where the environment causes certain genes to turn on and off. So just because you have data in your DNA that says it's going to be something doesn't mean it's actually going to be for you. So again, this is part of what makes kids look certain ways. This is why you don't want to have like gestational diabetes, because it can create epigenetic phenomenon and cause DNA to be turned on in the baby that would have never got turned on. And so there is some type of imprinting that does occur when it's in your body, but it's not ever going to just take some of your DNA. But it's like I started in the beginning, you will never question if that's your kid. I promise you, like, it is so amazing. One of our nurses, her name was Brenly, and a lot of people know her. They adopted a kid. This kid looks more like their dad than any other kids that they actually had genetically, and even X, and so it's just one of those things that just comes back to the point that I think no one should ever be afraid, because they're worried about that. And so I want to talk a little bit about the process, because I don't think that everyone understands the process. So let's say you're someone who wants to get donor eggs, and how do you even start that? Well, I think the first thing is trying to figure out, again, how many kids you want. And don't you agree, Doctor, saying, like, if you're wanting more kids, if you're wanting a full family, you really need more eggs. And so I think almost always it's going to be best to use a fresh donor in that situation if you're wanting to build a family of more than one or two. If you're not, and you're fine with just one, there are the two options, which are frozen eggs, and there are fresh eggs where someone goes through for you. There are many egg banks out there that you can look at, and you have to figure out what's important to you. If you're someone who's tall, you might not want to use a donor who's short. You might want to, if you're athletic, you might want your kid to be athletic because you really want them to do sports like you did. And so these are all those things you look at, and you get all this information about these donors. Now, certain ones have pictures, certain ones don't have pictures. Now, obviously, the first step is obviously to see a fertility doctor. That's going to be one of your first steps. But this is some of that process that's going to be going through. And then eventually, once you pick your donor, they'll work with your fertility place, and they'll work together. Now, some places actually make the embryos there, and then they send the embryos. Some places send the eggs. Some people just send the donor. And so, when people have at least a general understanding of how that process works, and then the transfer, everything else is the same way it would be with your own eggs. And so I'll leave it to Dr. Salem to see if he wants to add to that. But I think it's kind of good to understand that process. And then, some of the nuances I thought would be kind of good for us to tell patients about, some of the things that come up, so like with, for example, a fresh donor, they can't do it for 4 months because they're in college, and so they say, oh, I can't do it till summertime. Whereas with the frozen, you can do it faster. What other things could you add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. I think thinking about the process is so helpful. A lot of like our patients come in and they're like, how long does this take? Are we talking months? Are we talking a year plus? Because a lot of them also in the background have considered adoption. I think that's, for a lot of people, they're considering that. And I think a lot of people are surprised to find out that donor egg is much, 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 much faster and much, much, much less costly. But, I would say, yes, big picture, you start at a fertility clinic. The fertility clinic is going, advanced fertility clinics that really have all the bells and whistles are going to be able to have a third-party program that can navigate this very difficult world of where do we get eggs from? How do we do it? How do we make sure the sperm is optimized if we're using donor eggs? How do we make sure the uterus is optimized? Are we doing all the necessary appropriate studies? Because the last thing you want is a great embryo, and then you put an embryo, you do an embryo transfer, and they miss the fact that there was a polyp inside, or that the person maybe had rip-roaring endometriosis that wasn't addressed, or something of that kind. But I think there are all these interesting nuances that come up with donors. And one of them, for example, is, do we use PGT or not? Hey, you're telling me this is coming from a really younger donor. Do we need to? Should we? Do we have to? I think that's a pretty nuanced conversation. I think, for certain people, it can, and you've alluded to this quite a bit, like it can be really hard to find your person, your donor. For some people, they have what feels like an abundance of choice for whatever reason. And for other people, they really struggle with the process, going, month after month, looking at different donors, waiting for the right donor to come up. I think there's another part to it too, which is, and I think this gets misconstrued. It's this idea of the psychological evaluation. I think ASRM still calls it the psychological evaluation. I really think of it more like a psychological coaching, because what they're doing, and it's so valuable, and I think these reproductive psychologists do such a great job, is they present the questions like, are you going to talk to your child about this? Recommendation is generally yes. How are you going to talk to them? What questions are they going to ask? They help prepare you for things that are going to come down the road 6-10 years from now. And that's an amazing thing that they do that. Because I think that being physically ready and being mentally ready are very different things. And it really is something that you have to prepare well for. And so I think those are some of the things that play into this. And I want to mention just like one last thing that you were talking a lot about, which is this idea that it's a fragmented, and I hate to use this word, industry, right? So because this is healthcare, and healthcare shouldn't be industry, and blah 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 blah. But I'll get off my soapbox. But what's happening here is that some people only care about handing you some number of eggs. They're like, here's 6 eggs. We did our part. Good luck. We've tested the eggs. Our part's done. Or the same with the sperm. They're like, well, we've done everything to genetically test this individual and screen them to the best of our ability. And here's the sperm. And you have to pay for it. And then sometimes, and they don't have any guarantees necessarily or anything, but they're not held accountable. When things don't play out right. Now, to be fair, sometimes things don't play out right because the sperm is not good too. So you're using a donor egg, but you also don't have great sperm. And so, they shouldn't be held accountable to that. But I'm just saying it's a hard thing to stomach when everybody just has a small piece of it and nobody's owning all of it. And I think that's, as the fertility doctors, that's our responsibility, is to own all of it. I don't know. How do you see that part, that fragmentation, talking people through that?
Yeah, I think someone just brought it up really well. Josie here, she said, that agencies, are very helpful sometimes for like a third party consultation to be able to, the matching process and to help with some of that stuff. I agree. It adds a lot of money to it, and so it puts it sometimes out of out of reach for many couples. But there are sometimes you have to use agencies. So Dr. Salem started talking about, if you're Caucasian, I mean, you can throw a dart and you're going to hit about 3 people that that you can use as a donor. But if you are, for example, Indian, if you are Asian, it's a little bit harder. Part of that is because different cultures feel comfortable donating eggs. And so like, if you're Muslim, or something like that, it may not donate as many eggs. And so it gets really difficult in certain cultures. With Asian donors, it's very expensive. They know it is, and there's really a whole market just for Asian donors. And so That's a really tough part of it. Um, there's a lot of middlemen involved in this. So that was the thing where I was saying earlier, like I wish we could just barter and stuff, and get rid of the middlemen. So agencies are middlemen. That's what they are, and so they take a piece of the pie. And they don't just take from the pie, but they add parts to it. And so there adds more cost to the patient. With the fragmentation, I think right now I think frozen eggs changed everything, right? Frozen eggs just changed the game. It was before, it was these agencies that had donors and they held all the donors. I actually tried making a website. I'm trying to get all the places on it where everyone can look at all the donors, not just the group that they're that they're working with. And so we started the Stork Exchange, which was specifically for people to go and look at donors and stuff like that. And so we allow any company to use it for free. And again, to stop some of that fragmentation, people can look at everything. One of the things that you'll run into when selecting patients, and this is where I want to kind of spend a few minutes, is things you should look for when selecting patients. So keep in mind, if you go to an agency, they're just showing you their donors. So you got to be an advocate for yourself. Okay. That's not all the donors out there. That's that agency's donors. If you go to, I'll throw a name here because I'm not saying anything good or bad, the World Egg Bank, you're only going to see the World Egg Bank's donor. They're not going to show you Fairfax's donors. So it's really important to realize, like, that's not the only donor pool. So when you're looking, look around. And these ones that have paywalls, I stay away from them if they're saying to look at their donors. They should be freely letting you see the donors. But look around. So don't think it's just those. And there's even some outside the country, which is nothing wrong with that. I mean, there are some donor agencies that bring in from people out of the country, and again, it's not unreasonable to do, and it's on a set cost. But the next thing I wanted to kind of go over is when you're kind of choosing that donor, is have they ever done it before? And I think this is a really important detail, because like I said, just because you've never been infertile doesn't mean that you don't have infertility. Just because you got pregnant one time doesn't mean you're going to have kids forever, right? Now, if someone said 3-4 kids as a donor, you're like, okay, they're pretty good at this, especially if they only tried 3 or 4 times. But just because someone, when they're 20 years old, donated their eggs and never tried to get pregnant doesn't mean they might not have infertility. And so, like, for my clinic, when we get donors, there's things we look at. I had a patient one time who came to us, beautiful donor, amazing person, super smart, but I thought I saw an endometrioma. And I was like, oh, does she have endometriosis? I can't use her as a donor. So we brought her back in a few weeks, still was there. I'm like, yeah, I think that's an endometrioma. So in that situation, I knew she had endometriosis. And of course, we weren't going to use her donor. We said, unfortunately, we can't, it wouldn't be right for us. But aren't there possibly patients out there who are donating eggs that might have endometriosis as undiagnosed? And so when you grab a donor, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, have they had success? And unfortunately, the more success they've had, usually the more they charge a lot of these places. I don't know about with frozen eggs. Dr. Salem, have you ever seen, do the frozen egg companies charge more for successful donors once they frozen, or if any of the patients or someone listening to the show can jump in? I'm not sure about that. I know they do for fresh donors.
Right.
As someone who's had success, every time they go through it, they cost more.
Yeah, I think part of it. So no, the short answer is I don't think they do. But I think part of the problem, again, going back to this idea of like some fragmentation, is like it is a little hard to keep track of. The frozen eggs go over here. Embryos are created. Are they used right away? Do they land in a pregnancy right away? Is it being used on a gestational carrier maybe? So we kind of, I think it gets a little bit tricky to follow it quite as well.
Good point.
Yeah, so I don't know, but not that I know of that they kind of surge charge. It's not, like yeah. It is the original surge charging in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. What about with, as you mentioned about sperm? You're right. I mean, I think, donor eggs is very expensive. I want everyone to understand, like, even at places like us that try to lower the cost considerably, it's very expensive. And the reason why is there is a lot of cost. There's cost of medications for someone going through. The person wants money. The donor, at one point, there was a limit on how much they can make. Now there's not. And so there is a lot of expense, and it is passed on to the patient, unfortunately. But the question is, I guess, if someone had bad sperm and when they use donor eggs, I mean, that's a tough one, because if they're trying to get pregnant with their partner, and let's say they're not having success because there's poor egg quality, right? It's easy to blame the eggs. But if there is low sperm, the question is, I think we have to, you counsel the patient and say, listen, like, your fur may be really poor because of your sperm. I mean, that's as you said, that's why you can't compare them and say, well, have they had any pregnancies? Because it depends on, who the sperm was in some way. So
Yeah, absolutely. Is it one of these things where the sperm source is 69 years old and going through it, or maybe they're 32 and their partner had premature ovarian insufficiency, and so very different groups of people there. But yeah, I wanted to go back to the sperm for a second, because I think we've talked a lot about eggs. We talked a little bit about the donor sperm process, and I think the donor sperm process is an incredibly valuable part of this. And there have been some really heavy hitting players that have really kind of taken over the sperm bank portion of things. They provide a great service. They genetically screen the individuals, they prep the sperm, they make sure it's clean, they do all the infectious disease testing, etc. But it has also become, kind of, in my opinion, outrageously expensive. I mean, you could make a lot of jokes about how the guys get, $50 and a cookie to donate their sperm, and the other end of it, it's like $1,000+ to get a vial of sperm for an IUI.
Yeah.
And I think this has started confusing or made the picture murky of the effect, the kind of value behind using donor sperm for IUI after IUI after IUI. I mean, can you touch on that a little bit? Because there used to be a time when donor sperm was, not too long ago, a third of the cost of what it is now.
Yeah, I truly think it's because it's before, these banks, like you said, I mean, they're probably making tons of money now, but I think at least where I see it is where the LGBT community got in, and then they're like, wow, this isn't just, husbands that have bad sperm. Now we have this huge community we can sell to. And it changes even what I recommend, right? So I talk to patients and I say to them, I go, like, if you do 3 IUIs for most patients, let's say in our clinic would maybe pay $3,000, $5,000 to go through 3 IUIs in total. But if you have donor sperm, I mean, that's another 3,000 on top of that,
Right.
and so it adds so much cost. And so sometimes I have a conversation with people and I say, it might even make sense to do something like IVF, especially if they're wanting a big family, because then I go back to that point of, do you buy 9 vials of sperm so that way in the future you have sperm left, right? Because if you just go and buy 3 vials, you get pregnant, and then 2 years later you're like, okay, we're ready to have another kid, and the sperm's not there. Now what do you do? Do you sit there and go, oh, now we have to use a different donor? Now they're different paternal, and you may not want that. You already didn't want to use donor sperm, and now you're having separate different paternals. So I will sometimes recommend IVF and say the nice thing about that is 1 vial or 2 at the most vials, and now you have all these embryos, all the same paternal DNA. And so I think the pendulum will swing back eventually here. I think it will. But unfortunately, like you said, yeah, it's really changing. There only are a few players now. So
yeah.
I did want to talk about one thing too while we were talking about this. Is we've been talking a lot about anonymous donors. So everything we've been talking about has been anonymous. So meaning that these are people who you don't know, and you're buying eggs, you're buying sperm. So I think that's very clear. Make sure that's clear, because there is what they're called known donors, which I'll go over in a minute. What's important to understand, though, there really is, anonymous is not really a thing anymore. Meaning, at one point we could truly say these people are anonymous, and we do. We make sure we have the records that you can't even figure it out who's who. But the problem is now with like 23andMe and all these home DNA tests, people can find out if they have a mother or something out there, and they can figure out, like, wait a second, why does this person have the same DNA as me? And so it is important for everyone to know, when you use an anonymous donor, that it's not 100% anonymous anymore. Unfortunately, in the world of DNA now, it isn't. And so I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I think we should really also talk about known donors, because I don't think everyone I don't think everyone knows about known donors. I think there's some great things about known donors and some risky things about known donors.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, yeah, just on your point about the totally purely anonymous, it already doesn't exist. I think once upon a time we could tell patients, um, you're never going to have the risk of identifying who the biological egg came from. I think that world is no longer, we're not no longer in that world. I think, with all the genetic technology that's out there, I think it's a fair bet to guess that it's traceable. And I think it's better to prepare for that. Obviously, that doesn't change legal things, et cetera. Everything legally has been really ironed out to not create issues there. But I also wanted to talk about this idea of directed donors or known donors. Maybe I'll take the hat of the sperm donors first, because this is one that I get a lot, and it always turns into a longer conversation or a bigger conversation than I think my patients think that it will. So usually the conversation goes a little something like, oh, same-sex couple, we want to have a child together, and conveniently we have a friend who's just wonderful, we love him, and we would like to use his sperm to for the IUIs or for the IVF or whatever it might be. And this is going to be so easy. He's totally on board, willing, and he'll come in and donate next Thursday because he has a day off. And then I say, well, that's wonderful, but we got to take a step back. There's a lot that goes into a directed donor. The FDA has rightfully created many, many, many regulations and guidelines that we have to follow to have a directed sperm donor go through. So that includes very specific infectious disease testing that is pretty costly. That includes quarantining of the sperm. So you get the sperm, you infectious disease the sperm, and then you're supposed to wait months to then test again before you can use that sperm. So 6 months, but it can be shortened down to 35 days. There are also, unfortunately, issues about disclosure. So this person that wants to donate the sperm because he wants to be that good friend and nice person, and here I have sperm, doesn't always disclose all the things that are going on. Maybe they have they're at risk of certain sexually transmitted infections. They're not disclosing that. Maybe they're not disclosing their full family medical history. So it's a little bit complicated. And I think a lot of people do end up going down this path, but I think they find out that it is more burdensome, more costly, more legally like arduous, or like it's a heavier lift than they thought it ever would be. And that's kind of the way I kind of give people a heads up. I tell them we can do this, but I just want you to know it's not as simple as, Joey coming in next Thursday and donating a sample. But what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll put on the egg hat here, and it's, I think with eggs, I see the benefit a little bit more just because, especially if it's like a family member, right? So like one of my patients, she had a twin sister. I'm like, and she was, which I think this is actually, I'm going to take a tangent here, which I do a lot, but I'm going to take a tangent here for a second. This just to show you how hard it is for people to use donor eggs. My patient was an identical twin. They look exactly alike. They truly do. Like, I mean, it's unbelievable how much they look alike. She didn't know if she wanted to use her sister's eggs. She didn't know because it wasn't her eggs.
Wow.
And I said to her, no, they are your eggs. And she's like, no, but I don't know, it's not mine. I go, no, it's literally the exact same DNA. Like, I mean, it's the same DNA, other than some epigenetic phenomenon that occurred. It's the exact same DNA. And she was still, it was a hard step. I mean, it just shows you how hard it is. This is a point where even though the DNA is exactly the same, it'd be no different if someone took like their cells from their body and made, maybe she still didn't feel comfortable because she felt like they weren't hers. And literally that was the same DNA. So anyways, I thought it was really a great point for people to know, like, it's just, don't feel bad if you struggle with that even someone who had a carbon copy of themselves felt uncomfortable with it. But with eggs, with known donors, it's kind of an easier thing for me to swallow a little bit, because I'm like, that's a $30,000 expense for a donor, right? So if your sister can do it, your friend can do it, you reduce it down to pennies now compared to what it was before.
Yeah.
Sperm, I think there's a little bit more risk for such a small amount. Yes, $1,000 is a lot for sperm, no doubt about it. But $1,000 versus diseases you can get, I think it just kind of worries me a little bit. The thing that worries me though the most about known donors or directed donors is when they're not family. And what I mean by that is that obviously family creates a whole different dynamic, right? I mean, if your sister, like every time you see your sister, like, oh, that's my kid or something like that. But when it's somebody else, one of my concerns is, and I don't know if you've ever had this concern, is I'm never afraid about the person who donated it. Because they're like, no, I don't want anything to do with it. You can use the sperm. But I'm afraid of like the families or the partners or stuff. Meaning like I've seen families where, someone passes away and then they find out they have a kid with someone else they didn't know about. And then they're fighting for rights now to be able to see that kid. And the person's like, I have nothing to do with you. But, I mean, that's the stuff that kind of scares me a little bit with directed donors. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong using them. I think as people should know, there are contracts that have to be written and you got to make sure you protect yourself and stuff like that. But it is a great option, especially like if a sister or like a cousin or something, like, you make it feel like it's someone in your family. And so it's a real option to use for that. But when it comes to sperm, I think you and I have talked about this. Technically, you only need 35 days per ASRM guidelines, but I tell people 6 months is what I'd recommend for quarantining before using the sperm, just to check for diseases and stuff. I did want to bring up, so there was a couple things that came up about one thing. Is, remember we were asking about if the agencies charge more. One of the people on there said that the agencies usually don't for the frozen eggs. They haven't charged more whether they've had success or not. Another question someone asked, and it brought something to mind, was, do you have to pay for the donors like medical expenses? And so the answer is, if someone's going through a fresh retrieval for you, yes, you do have to pay everything. So, matter of fact, back in the day before we used to have loop run triggers, sometimes donors would go into ovarian hyperstimulation and they could even get hospitalized. And then you were held at the cost of that. Even though the clinic is the one that got them in OHSS, you were technically held responsible to pay for their medical bills. So there is this kind of open-ended thing where, yes, you have to pay some of these expenses for the donors. Whereas with frozen, you kind of are just purchasing eggs. So there's no risk of any other charges or any other medical expenses. So it's something someone asked a little bit ago. I know we're getting near the end of time, and this has been a really cool discussion. I think we could probably do 400 episodes on just donor eggs. It's such an interesting area, and I think it's just such an amazing thing for women that there's at least a choice out there. But I wasn't sure there's anything that you wanted, another topic you wanted to hit on, and then I was just going to look at a couple more of these questions for us to maybe answer for some patients out here.
I think just a passing thought, because we're on this topic, and you're right, we could probably talk about this a few more sessions, but I think we're very privileged in the US to have the position that we have, that donor eggs can be purchased, acquired, and used by people. So in many countries around the world, donor eggs are either illegal, or they have it such that you can't compensate a donor for the time and the effort and the risk that they go through to donate eggs. They have to do it for free. So that really limits the pool of women who are able to donate eggs. So I just wanted to say, I think we're really lucky, being in the US, practicing in the US, as both as fertility doctors and our patients, to be able to provide the service. And I think having that perspective is just one last little thing that I wanted to drop in there, since we're on this topic. But I know we have a couple questions, so let's go for them.
Yeah, and one thing I think really, you and I always like to talk about like interesting things up and coming. So there's question about, are we ever going to be at the point where we use an egg from a woman, but we use the nucleus from from the person who's going to be the intended parent? And are we not cloning per se, but they're actually recently there was a group that was able to make a gamete from somatic cells. And so what people understand what that means, so we're not talking over anyone. Somatic cells, or your cells, are not reproductive cells. Those are your regular cells that just duplicate, and reproductive cells actually, they don't just duplicate, but then they separate into half the numbers and rearrange a little bit different. So that way you're not making just duplicates of yourself. And so what they did was, is using somatic cells, were able to make gametes, meaning like sperm, and things like that. And so there's this question about, when will we be able to just take some of their DNA, rearrange it a little bit, and put it in the egg? And so I think it's pretty, right now it's just movies, I think, that will have that. I don't think we have are close to that yet, but it is something that people are thinking about. And I just wasn't sure if you've read any of that stuff. I always read all that nerdy stuff. So like, all the new stuff coming out. But again, when I say coming out, please understand, I'm talking about, this is research stuff being done on animals. There's no humans doing any of this stuff right now. So this is far, far from today. So
I know at one point they did, now this is has been made illegal. There were some groups that were exploring and had actually done some things like called mitochondrial transfers, where they took the mitochondria, so they take the cytoplasm out of the egg from a younger woman, and they put it into the egg along with the sperm and everything, like an older woman's egg, trying to kind of boost the egg's opportunity to
the nucleus. They took the nucleus from the IP, put that into the other woman's egg that had all the mitochondria. And that's which is funny, that's allowed in like pretty much like UK, it's allowed in Canada, but those countries don't allow gender selection. So it's funny, like, and we don't allow third party in ours. So it's funny, we don't allow that.
Yep.
With one of the questions, I think this is where we should end on, and that is sperm. Back to sperm again. When choosing sperm, so when you go to pick sperm, there's different types. There's what's called like ICI sperm. There is IUI sperm, and there's what's called ART sperm, or which is IVF. And so the two things I want to talk about is I'll probably let you take the lead on this if you want to, is what to do with those different ones. Why would you pick one over the other? But the thing I want to talk about just for a few minutes, and we'll end on this, I think would be a good ending, is I've had a lot of patients. There's some of these companies that will actually send them the sperm. And they just do inseminations at home, which is fantastic. That's great that someone can. But again, same price. They're still paying the full $1,000 for it. Few of these people ever get pregnant, though. And it's really interesting when I talk to them, like, they'll be like, oh, yeah, we have this sperm. And I look at it and go, this is IUI sperm. They're like, oh, yeah, we're just putting in the vagina. I'm like, that's not enough. That you have to use ICI.
That's never going to work.
Exactly. And so I was shocked by that. But again, that's where I go back to, I hate this industry. It's about money sometimes. And so, if you don't mind, I mean, why don't you touch on, why would we use the different types of sperm? And if people are going to do it at home, like, maybe just, send us a message, or just check with someone first that you're getting the right sperm, because clearly they're not checking that. They're just letting people buy sperm, and then they're doing home inseminations with ART samples, and it's never going to work.
Yeah. That's such a shame that they're selling people something that they can't ever use. You can't use IUI sperm in the vagina. It has to go through a special process to go into the vagina, into the uterus rather, to then be utilized. And these go back to some medical studies from the 50s and 60s, where they realized that you can't just take sperm and put it in the uterus and it'll work. It has to go through a specific process for it to work. So I do think that it's interesting, though, that they divide IUI and IVF sperm. I've always thought that is very interesting, because and I'd love to hear your perspective, but whenever I look at the samples that come back through, the IVF sperm tends to have lower quality, lower numbers, lower concentration. And it's kind of like, are they making the argument, well, you don't need that much sperm, so it's good enough for IVF? And that seems like a really weak argument to me. I'm kind of like, I want the best sperm possible, and then we'll do IVF. So I've always thought that that's a little bit odd that they would do that. I just feel like if you have a poor sample or two, don't package it up into IVF, just don't use it. And then of course, intravaginal or intracervical sperm, or there are now these kits at home, like Mosey Baby, which are very interesting. And I think they do have a valuable role, especially for maybe couples that there might be some sexual dysfunction or having a hard time timing sex in the same way. I think buying this very expensive sperm and then using one of these kits, again, I think it's a little controversial, because what's the efficiency of that procedure? And I'll be honest, especially with some of these Mosey babies and some of these things out here, I'm very interested to see, because the success rates might be quite high. We don't know yet. Their clinical trials haven't been done yet. So I'm excited to see those. But that's kind of my viewpoint on these various sperm preparations things. And again, I totally agree with you in the sense that I wish somebody would at least get counseling prior to making the purchase of, hey, am I buying the right part for my car? You know, it's I couldn't do it. I need to go to the mechanic to help me to get the right part for my car. So bad analogy, but what do you think, Dr. Amos?
I mean, in general, the ICI sample is like, basically, if you had someone ejaculate, that's your ICI sample. It's unwashed, it's not clean, and that has to be processed. So that's perfect for going in the vagina, because that's the same thing. If you put that in the uterus, that woman probably is going to beat you to death, because they're going to be so uncomfortable from the prostaglandins and everything that are in their uterus. IUI sample has already been processed. And so what's interesting about an IUI sample is that if you get it for IVF, you've already processed it. So depending on how they process it makes a difference on the quality of the sperm. So for example, let's say you're going to use like a Zymot chip. Using a Zymot chip with an IUI process sample rate has already gone through the centrifuge. It's already been damaged somewhat from the centrifuge. So you lose some of that. So I feel like IUIs are really best for IUIs. The problem with IVF samples, exactly, the point is you save because you're getting less, right? So they can aliquot it to more people. The issue is there's one part that people have to remember is if you're paying cash, you end up paying more in the end. Because if you use IVF sample, you will have to do ICSI. They do not give enough sperm to be able to do standard insemination. And so now you're going to end up, paying, we charge a fraction of the cost, but sometimes charge $2,000, $3,000 for ICSI. So now they say $400, you just paid $3,000. So you have to be careful. I think ART is great for someone IVF sample if let's say their insurance covers everything. They're like, yeah, I'll do that, save the money, perfectly fine. But if you're, one thing you can never go wrong is using ICI sample. And that's because it can be processed. And so we tend to tell patients, our clinic, we're like, listen, we'd rather you give us ICI, because then we can process it. We can put on a Zymot chip. We can sit there and do a standard gradient. There's a lot of things we can do with it. And so if you're doing it at home, ICI only. Anything else is not going to work. If you want to do IUIs, you can use ICI or IUI sperm, because now, one can be processed, the other one's already processed. And then again, with IVF, you can use IVF sperm, but if you have to pay for ICSI, just keep that in mind. Now you have to do ICSI no matter what. And, that could add a lot of expense. But yeah, it's like I said, we could go on and on. I mean, there's so much stuff here. And the only thing I'm going to end on, unless you have something else to add, was one thing someone said, which I didn't realize we never said, but I think we implied it, which was, we said earlier that you can always do donor eggs in the future. And someone asked, well, can you do it when you're in menopause? And that's exactly what we were talking about, that it doesn't matter your age. It's always possible, because it's someone else's egg and your uterus is always good. And so I'm going to give my piece, and I think you give yours, but I think donor eggs are amazing. I think donor sperm is amazing. I think, where we're at now is it's great that there are options for people right now. And if you're someone who might need it, don't be afraid to talk to people about it. There's tons of groups out there, and you can talk to people who have been through it, and people have had kids, and they can tell you how it's the best decision they ever made. And, like I said, if you can't afford it, there are companies out there that even do this sharing, where if you can give some of your eggs, maybe, or sperm or stuff like that, they can, share. But there's a lot of different resources out there. And first step is going to a fertility clinic and, starting there. So I'll leave it to you as the last word, Dr. Salem.
Yeah, no, I just want to reiterate the fact that I think that, a huge part of our role as fertility physicians is to give people options. And I feel, very fortunate that we live in a world with the technologies that we have to give people many options. There are many right and correct paths to parenthood. And the donor route is one of those. And I just feel that we're very fortunate to be able to offer it. And for the right people, it's a wonderful path. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And it's tough. So like I said, if don't feel bad if it's not where you guys want to go, but talk to your fertility doctor and they'll help you through that. As Dr. Salem said, I like that analogy. They'll be the map while you're doing the driving. So, well, Dr. I'm always fun doing this with you. I really enjoy it. I know we didn't have a lot of people on tonight, which gotta remind people that they're come on, ask these questions directly, and you'll get entered into the raffle. It's going to be going over several months here, but if you get on the show even without your face, you get 5 entries and questions get you one. But we definitely would love to have people ask their questions, because we don't know what to talk about. We keep trying to come up with stuff, and we're looking at your questions to figure out where to go next. So please feel free on one of these shows, just jump in and then ask questions. So Dr. Salem, it was a pleasure. Look forward to doing this again here in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a blast. I'll see you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.